He kneels in a crowded restaurant, ring flashing under the harsh lights. The room gasps in awe. Strangers clap as if love itself just claimed a victory, as if one word, yes, proved devotion conquers all. But look closer. It isn't triumph, it's desperation, polished into ritual. What we call romance is often the oldest mask for insecurity. Humanity dressed it in flowers and candlelight, sold it in commercials and love songs, framed it as sacred. But at its core, it's a performance, a script men have repeated for centuries, hoping it will buy them what power and status once secured with ease. For most of history, men didn't need this theater. A king didn't write poetry to win favor. He offered a fortress and his army. A wealthy merchant didn't serenade in moonlight. His grain silos, caravans, and ships carried more weight than 1,000 whispered promises. In a dangerous world, safety was the ultimate currency, and only the powerful could provide it. Women made choices not because of verse or roses, but because survival demanded it. King Solomon didn't build his harem with candlelit dinners. He offered palaces, servants, unshakable security. That was not romance. It was raw, pragmatic economics. But what happens to the men who are not kings, not warriors, not wealthy landowners? They are left in the shadows, stripped of advantage, staring at the gates of palaces guarded by armies they could never raise. Out of that despair was born the invention of romance, a clever substitution when resources were lacking. If you couldn't offer power, perhaps you could offer feeling. If you couldn't command armies, perhaps you could command words. The troubadours and knights of medieval courts created a mythology that flipped the script. Suddenly, the poor poet was more noble than the rich lord. Suddenly, the man who offered nothing tangible became the hero of true love. It was brilliant marketing, a consolation prize disguised as virtue, a game where the weak could pretend the rules had changed. And over centuries, that myth hardened into culture. Now, men are trained to equate their worth with their ability to perform. They plan the dates, buy the gifts, book the getaways, and their value is measured in the sacrifices they make. A man who forgets an anniversary or suggests a quiet evening at home is accused of being careless, even unloving. A woman who doesn't demand these rituals is seen as settling. Both become trapped in roles not of their own making, roles handed to them by centuries of cultural repetition. He provides, she evaluates. He proves, she approves. Yet beneath all of this, biology continues whispering its original truths. A woman may smile at poetry, but her instincts measure whether a man can provide stability. A man may kneel with roses, but his desire burns most for youth, beauty, and vitality. Culture has tried to overwrite nature with scripts and ceremonies, but nature doesn't negotiate. This is why so many romantic gestures feel hollow. They don't touch the ancient, silent codes buried in human attraction. They decorate, but they do not transform. Romance manufactures scarcity out of what should be abundant. Affection, intimacy, companionship, things that emerge naturally when two people are truly drawn to one another, are turned into commodities men must earn, as though love were a prize awarded for consistent performance. A man kneels to propose, and in that very posture declares himself supplicant, lowering his body to prove devotion. A gift is exchanged, not as a spontaneous act of joy, but as evidence of his continued worthiness. Each gesture reinforces inequality. One provides, the other bestows approval. It flatters in the short term, but corrodes in the long term, because no man can perform forever, and no woman truly desires to be treated as a prize, rather than as a partner. Entire industries thrive on this imbalance. Jewelers, travel companies, restaurants, each dangles status symbols before anxious men who fear that without enough spending, their love will be dismissed as inadequate. Engagement rings demand 2 months' salary. Weddings devour annual incomes. Romantic weekends swallow paychecks. Men toil, work second jobs, take loans, not to build futures, but to maintain appearances. The transaction is hidden beneath poetry, but it is a transaction nonetheless. The applause in the restaurant is not for love, it is for conformity, for playing the role exactly as the system demands. And yet, the cruelest irony is that women themselves often do not prefer the men who excel at this theater. They may delight in the gestures, enjoy the attention, but when decisions of long-term partnership arise, most still gravitate towards stability, competence, and security. The romantic poet, broke but devoted, becomes a temporary thrill. The provider, less expressive but steady, becomes the choice. Culture teaches women to praise romance, but instinct guides them towards strength. Men, meanwhile, bankrupt themselves performing rituals that rarely decide the outcome. They confuse effort with desire, forgetting that no amount of roses can substitute for the quiet gravity of real attraction. This creates a strange tragedy. Men exhaust themselves competing in escalating displays of devotion, each grander than the last, while women quietly measure different criteria. Social media amplifies the madness, turning relationships into public competitions. A man buys a trip for his partner, another must match it. A man proposes with a diamond of 1 carat, another must buy 2. The arms race spirals, not out of genuine need, but out of fear of appearing insufficient. The woman may not even crave the escalation, yet the culture insists she should, so the performance continues. And both find themselves unsatisfied. He, because his efforts never secure peace. She, because the gestures cannot substitute for authenticity. The truth is simpler and more terrifying. Genuine attraction cannot be purchased, performed, or proven. It either exists or it doesn't. When it exists, gestures emerge naturally, as expressions of joy rather than obligations of survival. When it doesn't, no performance, however costly, can force it into being. But the system does not allow men or women to rest in that truth. Instead, it whispers that the show must go on, that love must always be displayed, that the theater must never close its curtains. And so, men become actors in their own relationships, and women become judges of performances that were never meant to be staged. Relationships become auditions without end. The boyfriend must constantly prove he is still worthy of being the boyfriend. The husband must continually demonstrate he is still worthy of being the husband. Each man remains on trial, his evidence measured in dinners, vacations, gifts, surprises. He grows resentful, she grows suspicious. Neither trusts silence, because silence in a performance feels like failure. Neither trusts simplicity, because simplicity feels like neglect. And so they drift farther from the truth of one another, lost in the glare of the stage lights. What men discover too late is that romance, as culture defines it, is not love. It is obligation, dressed as beauty. It is the applause of strangers disguising the silence between two people who no longer see each other clearly. Real connection begins when the performance ends, when a man stops kneeling and starts standing in his own center, when he gives not because he fears losing her, but because the gesture is born naturally from who he is. When a woman stops measuring worth in roses and diamonds, and instead sees the quiet strength of presence, the steadiness of character, the authenticity that can't be purchased. The truth is that love cannot be bought, cannot be begged for, cannot be performed into existence. It thrives only in authenticity, when both enter the relationship not as buyer and prize, but as two whole beings choosing freely. The tragedy of modern romance is that it teaches men to trade themselves away and teaches women to accept substitutes for what they really crave. The liberation is in refusing the script, in recognizing that affection needs no receipts, intimacy needs no audience, and devotion needs no diamond. What remains when the theater collapses is what was always real, the raw gravity of two souls drawn together, not by performance, but by truth. Love becomes dangerous when it is confused with performance, when men empty themselves to be chosen, and women confuse approval with affection. But the moment the mask drops, when gestures are no longer obligations, but echoes of genuine desire, something rare appears, a bond that asks for nothing but presence, a union that is not weighed by cost or measured by applause, but felt in the quiet certainty that neither is pretending. That is where love breathes freely, beyond the stage, beyond the rituals, beyond the desperate proof. In that silence, stripped of theater, only truth remains, and truth is the only foundation that endures.